Good morning, everyone. I'm calling the meeting to order. This is the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. I'm Laura Lee Nicol, the chair of the committee. Remind everyone before we start to have your phones on silent, and if we need to leave the building, please exit through the doors on Granville Street and the muster areas in the Grand Parade. So I'll ask the committee members now to introduce themselves, beginning with the member to my left.
Morning, everyone. Nolan Young, MLA, Shelburne.
Good morning and welcome. Tom Taggart, MLA for Colchester North.
Good morning, John A. McDonald, MLA for Hants East.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Melissa Sheehy-Richard, I'm the MLA in Hants West.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan LeBlanc, MLA for Dartmouth North.
Hi, I'm Lisa LaChance. I'm the MLA for Halifax, Citadel, Sable Island.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Braden Clark, MLA for Bedford South.
Good morning, folks. Marco McLeod, MLA, Pictou West.
And I will now ask the member to my left to introduce himself.
Gordon Hebb, Council to the Committee.
And to my right.
Kim Langell, Committee Clerk.
I also note that we have officials from the Auditor General's office here in attendance as advisors. Also, I would like to open up the agenda, and we have officials with us from the Department of Finance and Treasury Board with respect to additional appropriations for the fiscal 23-24. I'll ask the witnesses to introduce themselves, beginning with the person on the left.
Thank you. Robert Bourgeois, Executive Director of Government Accounting with FTB.
Good morning. Lilani Kumaranayake, Associate Deputy Minister with FTB.
Good morning. Kelliann, Dean, Deputy Minister, Finance and Treasury Board.
Good morning. Geoff, Associate Deputy Minister and Controller with the Department of Finance and Treasury Board.
Thank you, and welcome, everyone. And now I will go to the Deputy Minister Dean to go with her opening remarks.
Thank you, and good morning, Madam Chair and committee members. I'll provide some introductory remarks, and then together we'll respond to your questions. I know that some of you are already familiar with the Department of Finance and Treasury Board's role and the process for additional appropriations. Others may appreciate a short introduction or refresher on these points. The Department of Finance and Treasury Board is responsible for ensuring we continue to meet the high standards set out for us by the legislature and by public sector accounting principles, so that Nova Scotians can remain confident in the overall management of our province's finances. The fiscal management provided by the professionals at Finance and Treasury Board meets these high standards and is uncompromised. This is recognized and affirmed by 3 major credit rating agencies that monitor senior governments across Canada. The Auditor General has also provided an unmodified audit opinion on public accounts for the year ended March 31st, 2024. This is the 24th year in a row the Auditor General has expressed confidence that Nova Scotians can rely on our financial statements. We take great pride in this accomplishment and strive for it every year. The Auditor General has also recommended legislative changes to our process for additional appropriations. We have appeared before this committee in the past to discuss these recommendations. I'm sure that will be part of our discussion again today, and we're happy to explain the careful consideration we've given to this matter and why we believe the system in place is transparent and accountable. Nova Scotians rely on their government to be responsive, whether that be due to extreme weather events such as forest fires, floods, hurricanes, or major snowstorms, or because priority areas need additional investment such as healthcare, housing, communities, and economic development. No priorities are static, nor are the province's financial circumstances. Additional appropriations can be better understood within the context of the budget estimates and public accounts reporting process. When the annual budget is tabled, the estimate of what each department can spend to achieve its mandate and responsibilities is presented. These are the figures that are subsequently approved under the Appropriations Act and provide the spending authority or appropriation for each department. At budget time, these departmental appropriations are the best estimate of the expected expenses and serve as the initial spending allotment for departments. Just as in day-to-day life, however, there are circumstances where our initial estimates of expenses will change over time. Departments are not permitted to increase spending if it goes above their initial spending allotment or appropriation. So they must request an increase in their spending authority, which is done through a request for an additional appropriation. Over the course of the year, The reasons for additional appropriations are varied, but could include increased use of programs and utilization pressures, such as increased usage of pharmacare programs or grants to seniors through expanded Home First program. Increased costs to deliver the program, such as the price of supplies and labor settlements. The need to respond to emergency circumstances, such as wildfires, floods, road washouts. Services such as snow plowing that are contingent on the weather. If there are more snowfalls or heavier snowfalls, this will mean that government needs to spend more than estimated to maintain the standards of safe roads. Other examples include transfers between departments or entities, such as the recent Housing Nova Scotia transfer, and accounting adjustments such as increases in potential environmental costs. At the time of budget, not all initiatives are fully developed. In this situation, the fiscal plan sets aside spending authority captured under the restructuring costs appropriation. Over the course of the year, as an initiative moves through an approval and the estimated costs are better known, restructuring costs can effectively be transferred into a department's budget. When this happens, the department needs an additional appropriation to increase its specific spending authority for the best estimate, even though funds were originally allocated within the restructuring costs appropriation. Since our last appearance, we've made more information about additional appropriations available. Staff explain investments during media technical briefings, and the minister is accountable to Nova Scotians and the legislature. And more detailed information is now posted online. We remain committed to continuing to report to Nova Scotians about the fiscal position of the province and how the elected government is responding through the year to the issues that matter most to them. Madam Chair, we look forward to addressing the members' questions. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll now open the floor for questions, and each caucus will have 20 minutes, starting with the Liberal caucus. Braden Clark, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. I appreciate it. As all of you obviously know, in March of this year, the Auditor General did a report on additional appropriations and calling into question, I would say, the value and the scale of them as they're currently being used in the last couple of years in particular. And I'll direct my questions to you, Deputy Dean, and then you can manage them beyond that to whoever's best to answer. But how has the department, or has the department at all, I guess, changed its procedures for the current fiscal year to minimize the amount of additional appropriations? Have there been any policy or administrative changes to try to tamp that number down a little bit?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, as I said, additional appropriations are a result of anticipated needs beyond what is initially estimated for a department. So they respond to things sometimes that are unforeseen, or as I said before, they're a way to move money from a restructuring account, for example, for something that we thought was going to happen, but that we now know is, and we can better quantify it. So I don't think it's a question of deliberately minimizing. These are transactions that need to happen as a result of decisions that are made throughout the year. And those decisions are made because of sometimes unexpected circumstances and sometimes planned circumstances. So I hope that helps to answer your question, but happy to elaborate further.
MLA Clark.
Thank you. And relative to, I don't know what the best time frame to look at would be, but relative to standard practice over the last 10, 12 years, let's say, for example, would you agree that additional appropriations over the last 2 fiscal years, which I believe is a little over $3 billion, 1.7, 1.4, that would be quite high relative to, like I say, over the last decade or so? Am I right in saying that, Deputy?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you. Yes, additional appropriations actually have grown, but then so have our revenues. And, the fiscal plan has changed over the years as well. And the fact that additional appropriations, particularly over the last several years, have grown, that is also a factor of the challenges that we had with the economy through COVID, where there was volatility, there was unpredictability, and the economy is beginning to settle out. So some of the swings that we had and the increases in additional appropriations, they do reflect priority spending and spending on the pandemic and other areas that government wanted to invest in, like healthcare, like housing, and some of the other areas of priority. So, it is a reflection of a couple of things, increased revenues, but also, the whole fiscal plan has shifted over the past several years. I don't know, Lilani, if you wanted to comment further on that, or Geoff, if you did.
Yeah, I mean,
Associate Deputy Minister Lilani.
Sorry, yes, and I think what was seen, and I get, for us, our things that happened this year reflect things that happened over the last couple of years, but also what we're anticipating in the future. So, for example, for our revenues, there was a great deal of volatility as we entered the pandemic. It became hard to estimate revenues given a number of factors that were bouncing around. And so when you're doing budgeting, you're trying to meet the needs of your priority programs for your priority clients, but at the same time, we always have the background of ensuring fiscal sustainability down the road. So it's always a balancing act. If there's increased fiscal capacity, that provides the opportunity to expand programs faster, roll out initiatives earlier. So I think that's the balancing act that departments and government does as day to day.
MLA Clark.
Thank you both for that, and I understand and appreciate that obviously things were chaotic and unpredictable during COVID. Obviously that was a once-in-a-century type of event, but obviously we are out of the acute phase of that at this point, and yet we still see significant additional appropriations. So I know the minister's made his position clear on this. I disagree with him on that strongly, and I wonder, has the department ever made a recommendation or presented options to the minister to say these would be potential changes to the Finance Act on additional appropriations that would bring us more in line with the rest of the country? We should do that, yes or no, or maybe, as the three options. Has the department put forward recommendations to the current Minister of Finance and the current government on that question?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you. We have had internal discussions around the Auditor General's recommendations, and I'll first start by saying that we greatly respect our working relationship with the Auditor General. We respect and appreciate and take very seriously her recommendations. And on this one, we remain committed to the process that we're currently follow. We think and believe that it is transparent. We think that we are providing Nova Scotians with the transparency and accountability that we are required to do under the Finance Act. Should government wish to make changes to the Finance Act, we will implement them. And I think, as you've stated, our minister has been clear that at this time he does not feel that there need to be any changes to be made. But having said that, we have also endeavored to be more transparent in providing more detailed information around the additional appropriations and posting them, on our website, and making sure that there is sufficient information so people understand what is included and why those additional appropriations were made.
MLA Clark.
Thank you, Deputy. And so I wonder, I know departments work differently from department to department. I've been in a few in the past, and I'm just curious: has the department ever brought a recommendation forward to the current Minister of Finance to change the Finance Act as it relates to additional appropriations? Has that happened?
Deputy Dean.
We've discussed the report and the Auditor General's recommendations, and at this time, the Minister has not requested us to make any changes.
MLA Clark.
Thank you. But the department has never recommended to the Minister we should change this to be in line with other provinces and the federal government.
Deputy Dean.
Right now, the department's following the requirements set out under the Finance Act, and we believe that we are executing those to the best of our ability. We recognize that other jurisdictions do it differently. It doesn't mean that we're not being compliant. We are absolutely compliant with the Finance Act. It is working for Nova Scotia. And other provinces have different practices. For example, other provinces don't have the Auditor General do a review of their revenue estimates. We do. We may be the outlier there. So just because another province follows this particular path doesn't mean that's appropriate for Nova Scotia. So at this time, we're continuing to follow the Finance Act. If we're asked to make changes, we'll happily implement them. At this time, we're not being asked to do anything differently.
MLA Clark.
Thank you, Deputy. I appreciate that, and I know that the department is following the Finance Act as it exists, and I'm not debating that point. I'm just more about where we should go, and I understand that that's not necessarily your job to change the Finance Act. But you mentioned in your previous answer that you believe that the Finance Act as it exists today is working for Nova Scotia and for Nova Scotians. So I guess why do you think that would be my question, because, you know, again, not your responsibility, but we just wrapped up an extremely short fall session. And look, this has been going on for quite a long time across multiple governments. I think the amount of time we spend in the legislature is shrinking to the detriment of all parties, because not every party is going to be in power forever, and to the detriment of Nova Scotians. And we obviously have time in the yearly calendar to debate additional appropriations as other governments do. And as I've said in the past, this government has a majority. They can pass additional appropriations and then pass them in the legislature, essentially as a rubber stamp, and as it were. So my question, I guess, would be, how do you justify, or how do you explain the argument that this system is working for Nova Scotians, and how do Nova Scotians have confidence that they're getting good value for money when, you know, 10 to 12, 13% of the overall budget is being spent and allocated outside of the legislative process?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you for that. So I will ask Geoff to respond, but before I do, I do want to point out that you know, there is a process that's followed for the approval of additional appropriations, and that requires the deputy head to go and make a request through the minister. The minister makes that request through the deputy, or through the finance minister, and then ultimately approvals provided by the executive council, and then through the governor and council. So I know you're aware of that, and I appreciate, you know, the questions around the ability to debate in the legislature. These decisions are approved under the Finance Act, following what's prescribed there, and there is a level of accountability and transparency that is part of that in terms of the ability to ask questions, the ability to, as we're discussing here, talk about some of the additional appropriations. The Finance Act was changed in 2010, and I think it made the process clearer. Geoff was closer to that than I was at the time, but perhaps you can speak a little bit about the transparency and accountability aspects.
Associate Deputy Gatien.
Yeah, thank you. And what I might do is just touch on the budget as well at the beginning. So the budget and additional appropriations, they do go hand in hand, and they have to work together. At the beginning of the year, the budget is tabled, debated, and that really does set the purpose and the terms of the business plan for government as estimated, as all the underlying assumptions that would feed into that. That goes through robust debate and then ultimately is voted on in the House and enacted. So with that, the appropriations are approved. We have an Appropriations Act that works as our benchmark, I guess, that we measure against. Then, as estimates imply actuals will be different. That's why we forecast through the year. And as we go through a forecast process, there are all sorts of events that will have unfolded, some decisions made. As Deputy Dean's mentioned, many things are utilization pressures. Maybe the price of oil was different than we had anticipated, so there's pressures in different departments. Inflation happens, cost escalation happens. So there's all sorts of things going on within a department that might require an additional appropriation if everything else proceeds as anticipated. So at the first moment where they believe that their appropriation is insufficient to carry on what their purpose for the year is, which is approved through the estimates process that's in the estimates book, they need to submit a report to the Minister of Finance indicating we believe we need an additional appropriation to fulfill our activities for this year. So from there, it's anchored to the purpose, and then there's a decision that ultimately Executive Council is asked to make, and the Governor and Council is asked to approve. So again, as Deputy Dean said, it sort of runs the myriad of utilization pressures, cost escalations, some changing circumstances, accounting changes can drive that. Other economic shifts, interest rate changes can drive. So it's not all a decision of something to do or not. Some things are a little more just changing circumstance. Why I believe that remains appropriate and why I'm professionally comfortable with this process is the Act does give Executive Council and Governor and Council the ability to adapt to the changing circumstance. So with that, I believe the transparency when a public forecast, those dates are etched in the Finance Act. It has to be before September 30th. There can be variation in what day, but before the end of September, before the end of December, with the budget, we have to do a public forecast. Typically, that is where we do additional appropriations. When we've gone through a robust review of the changing circumstances, and there's quite a lot of scrutiny. With that comes the Order in Council and comes the technical briefings, the Minister's address. So I think the accountability and transparency is there, and then the tabling in the House or with the clerk if the House isn't sitting. So I think we maintain our high standards of accounting, of financial reporting, and of communication through the process. So that's where I'm professionally comfortable that the process is working.
MLA Clark with about 4 minutes.
Thank you, ADM Gatien. I appreciate that. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just want to make sure I get to my last couple of minutes. I wanted to make a bit of a statement, I guess, less so than a question on this, but I think additional appropriations is one piece of a bigger puzzle, which is the fact that, in my view, we have a growing democratic deficit in Nova Scotia, which has been growing for some time, which concerns me quite a bit, even though it might seem arcane and academic to lots of people. But additional appropriations is part of it. Incredibly short sittings is part of it. A weak legislative agenda is part of it. A broken law amendments process is part of it. Centralization of power in premiers' offices, prime minister's offices at the federal level is a big part of it. And it just, it kind of discourages me quite a bit. And again, I don't think this is a one-party, one-term issue. It's a growing issue that I think all MLAs should be really worried about and concerned about, because nobody's ever in power forever, and eventually you're on the other side of the coin, and that's troubling. So I just wanted to make that statement because it's something that's been bugging me over the last couple of weeks, believe it or not. I guess one of my final question, because I think I have about 2 minutes. Deputy Dean, I know that there's been a significant amount of additional appropriation spending, and the government has forecast significant deficits over the last couple of years in the range of $400 or $500 million, and then at the end of the year has come out with surpluses as a result. So can you just give me a quick, and again, I got about a minute and a half left, a quick overview of where that difference, I guess, is coming in, where that extra revenue and where that is primarily coming from? that's filled that gap to take us from 500 million in the red to, the black, essentially.
Deputy Dean?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm going to ask Lilani to provide some detail on those revenue differences. Lilani?
Associate Deputy Lilani?
Okay. So, and I'll just give you kind of where we ended up in public accounts. For example, in 22-23, we had a revenue increase of about 1.9 billion. Of that, almost half of that, 929 million, is what we call prior year adjustments. In the 23-24 year, we closed our public accounts at a revenue increase of 1.3 billion, and of that, 536 million is what we call prior year adjustments. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about that prior year adjustment.
Yeah.
Essentially, what happens is we don't know what our actual revenues are when we do our budget estimates. We actually have quite a lag because, for example, our tax revenues for 2023, the deadline for filing your taxes is April 30th, but our budget was February, right? And in fact, we still don't have the data in terms of tax revenues for 2023. So we are always modeling and estimating our revenues, and then when you get actual information, there's usually a difference. And that difference leads to what we call these prior year adjustments. So sometimes they're up and sometimes they're down. Over the past several years, because of the economic volatility and changes that we've seen, our models had a bit of trouble in predicting how large the revenue growth would be. So we ended up having, I'd say, high or larger than ordinary prior year adjustments. So that explained a chunk of that revenue increase. The other part is when we get information that our revenue is growing faster than we anticipated.
Thank you. Time has elapsed for the Liberal Caucus. We now move to the NDP Caucus. MLA Lachance.
Thank you very much. And thanks so much for being here today. I'm just going to hop right into some questions. So, one of the things that concerns me about the growing use of additional appropriations is about how it will actually affect government budgeting and decision-making within departments. So, I've worked in the federal government, I've worked in the provincial government, worked in line departments, worked in central agencies, and, each year, if you are managing a government program, then you have a certain budget. You anticipate lots of things, right? Like, what's the growing need? Is there a federal agreement coming down the lines? Is there a union settlement that might happen out there? Like, you have, good management of the program means that you're aware of all of those external possibilities and also thinking about, like, so what is the government objective with this program? How are we going to meet it? If we have, 10 people that we serve now and we want to serve 12, how do we get there? And so all of that happens, and then you get to the budget process, whereas as of April 1st, a department has a certain budget. Within that budget, programs with certain budgets, and you go forth and implement your programs. And that's where the budget update, forecast updates come in, right? Because then you're asked as a program manager, okay, so now by July, you were supposed to have spent 25% of your budget, and actually, oops, I've spent 50% of the budget. Okay, well then what's your plan? Why did that happen? What's your plan for not overspending by the end of this current fiscal year? Or are you underspending? And can we reallocate some of that money, right? So this is the government decision budget making process, and I think it's really important. And I think my concern is that with the current reliance on additional appropriations that are not sent to the legislature, that there's fundamentally less concern. There will be a growing approach to budgeting that is less focused on that type of detailed planning. And, I think, one of the additional appropriations that's been made recently around healthcare transformation initiatives of 35 million, of course that's important. Of course no one's going to argue that, workforce strategy, primary care, access and flow, cancer care, these are all really important investments. But I would argue that since there is supposed to be a strategy on reforming healthcare, that this should be part of the planned work of the department. This should never be something that would be a surprise in a budget or programming process. And I guess I would just invite you to comment on that.
Deputy Dean.
Thank you very much. And that is you have a really great knowledge of how department budgeting works, so thank you for that. I would say that the use of additional appropriations, though they've gotten larger, in no way would impact the focus and the attention that departments have in their budgeting process, in how they monitor their programs, in how they provide forecast information to the Department of Finance so that we can then update and provide forecasts. There is rigor in that process, and the use of additional appropriations does not change that rigor. I think part of the challenge is utilization pressures, things that are a bit beyond control because they're based on population growth, or they're sometimes based on increased usage of programs that was not foreseen. So I think in that instance, the additional appropriation is the mechanism by which that increase is requested. So, I don't think that usage equals lack of accountability or lack of rigor or lack of attention to a department's budget and the process that's being followed. And I don't mean to say that you were intimating
MLA
that at all.
Lachance.
Thank you. Yes, and I definitely wasn't. I was just like the effect on how decision making is happening, and but I do think that it also has an effect. So in one portfolio that I'm relatively familiar with, which is agriculture. Certainly the minister has said time and time again in the House, well, what did you didn't want us to help farmers out from the polar vortex, which is clearly not what we are saying. But reacting to climate change in agriculture is not a surprise. This should not, polar vortex, Hurricane Fiona, a big snowstorm, none of that should be a surprise if we are anticipating the effects of climate change and planning mitigation, adaptation responses. And in this case specifically, this isn't even what the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture, the Nova Scotia Fruit Growers Association, Horticulture Nova Scotia, all of the primary industry groups all say, actually, we don't want any more of your one-off programs that respond to a climate impact. We want ongoing business risk management programs that acknowledge the risk that's out there. And this is, so I actually really am concerned that by relying on this, that we're not making the right policy decisions and the right allocations along the way. And I guess my question would be, is there a point where it's going to be too much? What's too much in terms of additional appropriations?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you for that. I don't think I can sit here and say that's too much, that's not enough, because the additional appropriations, again, are meant to increase a department's budget for a specific purpose or something that they didn't foresee happening. So, again, there are guardrails in place, and that is the overall budget, and we continue to look at the fiscal plan and the pressure on the fiscal plan. So, governments make decisions within these parameters. They know in general terms what their revenue capacity is. If that revenue capacity increases, then there is a potential that an additional appropriation could be made for something that was unforeseen.
Order, MLA Lachance.
And I appreciate that. I just wanted to stop you at that point because it's true. If you have increased revenue, so we have increased population growth, the government has increased tax revenue, that's great, right? And of course, Nova Scotians want that invested in areas where we need investment, healthcare, housing being two primary areas. But you can still have those increased revenues, you can still make those investments, and you can still make it, you can still engage with the legislative process. And I think that's sort of the second part of really where my concerns are. And maybe we can't anticipate all the effects of climate change. Maybe we can't anticipate the level of homelessness, although I think we could do a lot better on preventing homelessness. But we could do all that, we could respond, and we could still go back to the legislature. And I know you talked about other jurisdictions. We're the only jurisdiction that doesn't do this in Canada. And I don't know how we can understand that to be working for Nova Scotians. And maybe I'll let you have a comment.
Deputy Dean?
I'm just trying to figure, I know I've answered this before, and we do believe that there is transparency and accountability. There is an opportunity to debate these decisions after the fact, after they've been made. But again, we're following what's in the Finance Act. We are providing updates 3 times a year through legislated requirements in our forecast updates. When the public accounts are released, if there are changes that have to be made to basically true up those appropriations since the budget process, we do that. We're posting all of the information, and we believe that we are doing the best we can to honor our obligations and to give Nova Scotians the information they need.
MLA Lachance?
And actually, I was also around during the 2010 revisions to the Finance Act. So, obviously, the best available knowledge was used to shape those changes. And I guess I would argue that 14 years onwards, we have new information, right? So, I think, so if, in fact, the government budgeting environment and the context is changing, if it's becoming so much more unpredictable, then what changes would we, ideally see in a Finance Act? And I think one of those things is around being accountable. So, if we could argue maybe that, population change is going to continue, the pressure of climate, the need to invest in healthcare, like all these trends are going to continue. So we need a process that's more responsive. And, just because I apparently need better hobbies, I did spend some time going through the OIC database from 2010 to the current year. And, if you look back, so under the NDP government, there were 2, I think, additional appropriations, one for 50 million, one for 60 million. They were quite specific. But even looking back at the Liberal government, and, and I will give credit where credit's due, but there were very detailed OICs. You could really see and understand if you walked through 2020 what was happening. Was there a pandemic that was completely changing the entire world? Absolutely. And was government having to respond? Absolutely. So, you would look at things like, December 2020, like there was an allocation for additional PPE for healthcare facilities, and it was also a very detailed number. And I guess I would just argue that the type of information that we're receiving now and the amounts, and I would say that that's the other thing, is just the sheer volume. But we're not getting the same information. Like when you look through recent appropriations, sometimes it'll be like department by department. So it'll be like Department of Agriculture, 12.9 million, but you actually don't know what the program validation is for. Even the notes that have been presented here in terms of, some of the additional appropriations for September 2023, for instance, we see notes of like primarily due to a range of things, but we don't have the specific numbers behind those. So I guess I would argue that there's lots of room for improvement. And, I'm curious about the political reluctance to consider this. And maybe you can offer some comment on that.
Deputy Dean?
Thank you for that. So we have, enhanced the information that's provided through our summary sheets that list all of the departments and have added detail more than what might be posted in the OIC, so I can appreciate where you would see a difference there. But these sheets do explain in greater detail what the changes were. I think also in the forecast update technical briefing that's provided and the information that's provided at the time of those forecast updates, we go through department by department and explain the variances and explain the changes that are made. I will admit I have not looked back at the OICs from the previous government. But we have taken steps to increase and enhance the information and explanations at the department level. Geoff, did you want to add anything?
Associate Deputy Gatien?
I think all that I would add is that, with the layout of the summary sheets that we now post, which was a result of recommendations we had to increase the transparency. If there's more information that's desired, it does indicate what department to reach out to and ask. So our intention is not to try to capture all of the information in it, but to give helpful commentary and then let people know where to follow up and ask if further information is desired.
MLA Lachance.
And I appreciate that. And, I just think, should you find yourself with some free time, Deputy Mr. Dean, I would suggest taking a walk back through the OICs of the last 14 years and having a look. And it would probably maybe better explain, sort of what I'm indicating is, it's frankly a much clearer story of why those additional appropriations were made, even if they didn't go to the legislature. And I guess I would just continue to. I appreciate the notes that are being offered, but things like Sept modernization, which as far as I can remember, has been like a thing happening in government since like 2000. So it is, to me, it's entirely predictable that you got to spend some money on SAP modernization, especially like 4.7 million. And I know it's a small amount. I do understand, but this is exactly the type of spending that shouldn't be a surprise that departments should be prepped for and should be part of the overall fiscal plan that does go to the legislature, that is subject to public scrutiny. And I feel like we're asking for so little increase in public scrutiny. I mean, at this point, we're asking, why doesn't it come to the legislature, even if it's, after the point of an emergency allocation? So, we're just asking for so little, and maybe you wanted to make a comment on that.
Deputy Dean.
Thank you very much. And I did just want to pick up on one point that you made with respect to, why aren't departments seeing that, or are they perhaps not estimating that SAP is going to continue to cost, money? And I just wanted Geoff to make a comment around that, please.
Associate Deputy Gatien.
Yeah, so we've been using SAP since the late 90s. Right now, this is not standard SAP work. That's been going on over the past 20 years. We're having to modernize the system to go to a cloud-based solution rather than our current system. So our current system is coming to end of life in a number of years. So this is a multi-year plan trying to bring 3 sectors into one. With that, we have a lot of consultants, we have a lot of testing, we have a lot of complexity with GL structure, cost centers, all of that. It's a huge project, huge undertaking, and little changes in ripples to deal with business challenge. If we don't have people available to come testing, we need to take them out of their day jobs to come spend days or weeks on the project. So with some other unpredictabilities. So that's where time shifts, availabilities, and progress does not go exactly as planned. So
MLA Lachance.
Apologize. I appreciate that explanation. Now we'll have to have a whole meeting on SAP spending. But one of the Auditor General's recommendation was to complete staff assessments for grant and subsidy submissions made to Executive Council and its committees, and to provide the assessment to decision makers, which I have to be honest, I would assume is part of the process. It's certainly ways in which I have worked previously, in particular, I think of the federal government. So why wasn't this accepted? What, in your view, why wasn't this recommendation accepted?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you for that. We did look very closely at the Auditor General's recommendations with respect to this topic. And we reviewed them, and we will be taking some actions. We'll look at our grants management policy and see if any policies there require updating and how we actually could improve guidance to departments. With respect to staff assessments, part of the challenge we had is, the process that was being requested for us to follow was very specific. And that approval process is actually the purview of government. We can't accept a recommendation to change a process that is the purview of government. However, we do know that there needs to be flexibility for decision-making. We provide as much information as possible, complete analysis, and sometimes that happens in different forms. The staff assessment is a critical piece, and we...
MLA Lachance with a minute and...
And I apologize, and hopefully you can continue with your response. So my question is, so if this is a decision of government, essentially, to change this process, did the department recommend this particular recommendation from the Auditor General to the minister?
Deputy Dean.
Sorry. Thank you. So we reviewed these very carefully, and we looked at what was in our authority to accept. And really, that process, the decision-making process of Executive Council office lies with them. It's our responsibility to provide the information to the best of our knowledge and the best, most thorough analysis that we can provide in the time that we have to do so. And, you know, that due diligence is taken very seriously, and staff continue to provide the reports and the information that's required so that officials can make the best decisions that they can. Oftentimes, there's other places where that information comes from. So we have one piece of that decision-making process.
With 28 seconds remaining, MLA Lachance.
So what would be these other places that information would come from that feeds into government decision-making?
Deputy Dean.
There can be information that comes from reports. There can be information that officials receive. There can be conversations that happen that, you know, we may not be privy to. And that is all within the purview of the Executive Council operations and their authority.
Order. The time has ended for the NDP caucus. We will now move to the PC caucus with MLA Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess just in simple terms, I'm wondering if you could explain the additional appropriation process and maybe include the key differences between the regular budgeting process.
Deputy Dean.
I'll ask ADM Gatien to do that.
Associate Deputy Gatien.
Sure. I'll try to be perhaps a little more brief than I was the last time. But give me the hook, I won't be offended. With the budget, that's where we're looking at the whole, effectively, business plan of government. So we try to pull together our view of the economic circumstance that's likely to unfold over the 4-year horizon, longer, but we focus on the 4 years, so the medium term. We look at how that will translate to revenue, and then we look at different program spending, trying to integrate priorities, try to facilitate any trade-offs or decision-making of Treasury and Policy Board, ultimately Cabinet, and then to table the budget. So the budget becomes I think of it as the financial articulation of government's business plan. From there, the priorities are set. The narrative in the estimates books describe what the purpose of the departments or appropriations are for, and then that becomes a benchmark for the activity. Then when the year begins April 1st, if the budget's been passed, then you start to forecast and work within the confines of your appropriation and your departmental business plan. As events change, you try to project to the end of the year. So the forecast becomes what actual has been incurred to date, what experience have we seen, try to look at the trends, and then you're trying to, in the forecast, actual to date plus expectation to get to March 31st. And when your expectation to get to March 31st starts to push you towards your limit, your appropriation level, if you exceed that, that's when you have to start having conversations about, do we need an additional appropriation, or are there other internal mitigations that they would look at? When it becomes clear to the head of the appropriated entity, we would ordinarily think of those as departments, but we do have debt servicing costs some pension valuation adjustments, other appropriations. If we think that those are insufficient for where we're going to wind up at the end of the year, then an additional appropriation needs to be sought. Through that, the reporting department submits, the minister submits a report to the Minister of Finance, which has to be reviewed. And then ultimately, if accepted, then it gets submitted through a report and recommendation. So there is some central review, some discussion between departments and central agencies about are there other mitigations, are the estimates internally consistent with what other experiences are. So that's kind of how it culminates into an R&R seeking an additional appropriation.
MLA Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just talking about how events change and stuff. Like I know additional appropriations would have been used during the Hurricane Fiona cleanup and some other natural disasters, I guess. I'm wondering if you could speak on how immediately available funds can impact our disaster preparedness, and maybe, in your opinion, what are the risks we could be exposed to of delaying these types of funding?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, there is no doubt that, having the flexibility of being able to respond quickly in urgent situations and situations like you described is critical for any government. So, in the case of Hurricane Fiona or floods, it was critical that the government was able to allocate resources quickly and then reflect that later, because it would have exceeded the authority of one of the departments. But this is what governments are faced with. Circumstances where they must make decisions sometimes quickly in response to something that is completely unexpected in order to protect Nova Scotians, in order to protect their citizens. So, that is one of the reasons why the additional appropriations process is critical for government operations.
MLA Young.
Thank you for that, Deputy. I'll pass it on to my colleague, MLA Sheehy-Richard.
MLA Sheehy-Richard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just keeping with the theme of the next steps, and after those decisions are made, in simple terms again, so that we can understand for the general public, like how is the process to provide that information to the public done?
Deputy Dean.
If I could just ask clarification, you mean after the decisions?
MLA Sheehy-Richard.
I'm sorry.
I should know better, Madam Chair. Like, how does the additional appropriations process provide the information to the public once it's decided, like once the new funds have been allocated?
Deputy Dean.
Well, typically you would see the additional appropriations at our legislated reporting periods. So you'd see a listing of those in the forecast updates that happen in September, December, and then with the budget. So that's when there would be line of sight to the fact that an additional appropriation would have been required for a particular initiative because it would have gone beyond that department's budget. That's the official reporting of the additional appropriation that would have been required for the department to complete that purpose, that program, to provide that service.
MLA Sheehy-Richard.
Thank you, Chair. And then in the 2023-24, I think it's that time we were looking at in this report, I was just wondering if you could provide an example of when additional appropriations, like when one was necessary, and also what measures are in place to ensure that the additional appropriations process isn't misused.
Deputy Dean.
Yes. So, departments cannot spend without authority. So, there are strict rules for departments. When they are allocated their budgets, they cannot spend beyond those budgets or those estimates for their departments. So the ability to spend has to be authorized by Executive Council, and that provides, that level of accountability and assurance that departments have approval to go beyond their allocated appropriations. So I think that's the first point. And some examples of additional appropriations in 23-24, as you had requested, wage settlements. It's an interesting one because what happens with wage settlements is that increases what departments may have in their appropriation because they don't know at the time of budget what the outcome will be. So there may be an estimate, but they may not have the full estimate. And so that money is held. I talked about restructuring. So that money is held, and then it is appropriated back to the department as it's required so that they have the resources to honor that commitment. So that's an example of one that's, it's an expected expense, but they don't know the amount of the expense, so it has to be held until it can be put back into the department. Homelessness initiatives. There's another example of government needing to respond to challenges, very challenging situations, and basically trying to do whatever it takes to address the homelessness situation and purchase modular housing, purchase pallet shelters, purchase things that can help relieve that pressure, which would have been required beyond what a department may have had in their current estimate. We talked about disaster assistance to wildfires and flooding. The other piece I might mention is remediation of abandoned mine sites and cleanup in Boat Harbor, because oftentimes additional appropriations are required in those situations because what we originally estimated the costs to be may grow, and then it requires an additional appropriation for the department to include that amount. So I think Rob Bourgeois could give further details around the environmental aspects of that and the reasons why we have to appropriate in those circumstances, if you would like.
MLA She Richard, do you wish to hear from
Sure.
Mr. Executive Director Bourgeois?
From an environmental liabilities perspective, it's based on timing, right? From the budgeting, the information that you have at hand on how you estimate those types of large liabilities. For the most part, we have a budget at year end and we have an estimate, but then more information is provided, more testing, more consultant reports are received throughout the year that impact those estimates. So at that point in time, when we do receive that information from a public sector accounting standards perspective, we have to update our estimates. So as part of the additional appropriations process, that's when we would be adjusting those estimates. So for Boat Harbor, for abandoned mine sites, for all of the other contaminated sites that the province is responsible for in the province.
MLA Sheehy Richard.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I will pass it to my colleague, MLA Taggart.
MLA Taggart.
Thank you, Chair. This is actually very interesting and informative for me. Others have spoken, given commentary, about being involved in these different, budgeting processes at this level, which I really haven't. But I guess first I want to note that both previous governments accepted this as status quo or whatever. Certainly I can't speak to what they had challenges of their time and what the priorities were, and I'm kind of sitting here thinking a little bit about armchair quarterbacking, and stuff like that. It's easy to kind of pick things apart, but, we're in a, they talked about, they recognized the crisis of COVID, certainly we do too, but, I need to say this, and I have a question for Associate Deputy Mr. Lilani, but that we're in different times today, where, our government came in, accepted a challenge in healthcare, which was in crisis, and spent tremendous amount of money. These are different times, right? We put historic funding into housing, all the while we're facing, the same challenges that every other province in the country has. So I'm really interested in how you really actually get that budget together, and how you can even, like it must be I mean, I was clearly you're all pretty, you guys got this figured out a lot more than I do, but, it must be very difficult to figure that out. Like, so challenges, I can't help myself on this because so look at the challenges that we faced in the last 2 years just with carbon tax alone. Like, for example, like I filled up with gas this morning and I speculated while I was standing there pumping gas that if the carbon tax wasn't there, I would be pumping my gas for around $1.13 or $1.14, and nobody ever dreamt that would happen. And I'm telling you that has a significant impact on our economy. So I guess what I would like Deputy Minister Lilani to finish her discussion or explanation on how you put this whole thing together with respect to what was it, prior year adjustments. Laymen, people on the street like me don't have any idea what that is and what those challenges are. So I wonder if you could kind of take that a little bit further.
Associate Deputy Lilani with layman's terms.
Okay. How I explain it to my dad. How about that? Okay. So I'll start from kind of scratch. As I mentioned to MLA Clark, we don't actually have revenues. We don't know the amount of revenues we're going to get from taxes when we do our budget. For our main sources like personal income tax, corporate tax, people have filing deadlines, and the filing deadlines are after our budget. And then once you filed your tax forms, they go to CRA. CRA processes them, and at a certain point, CRA actually sends us the tax data. But that whole process takes about 18 months. So we have a lag in terms of the time when we start to get actual tax revenue information. So in order to do our budget estimates, what we do is we do two things. One is we know taxes are affected by how the economy is working. So we do our economics team does an economics forecast. So what they do is say, what is our anticipated growth rate for gross domestic product? What do we expect in terms of compensation for staff, and how is that growing? What is our anticipated growth rate for our population? There's about 250 different variables that they look at. Then we produce an economic forecast, and then that gets sent over to our tax and revenue group, and they actually have a model for each type of tax. So they have a personal income tax model, they have a corporate tax model. And what we do is we take the economic information, and we have also the past information on taxes over the last, how does personal income tax vary by income or et cetera. So we have statistical information from the past, plus our economics forecast, and we put them all together in a model, and we spit it out. Okay. My staff are going to kill me. So that's kind of how it works. So I can tell you right now, we will never be exact to the dollar amount when you do something like this with the modeling, because there's always going to be a difference. So let's say we have a budget, 18 months later, we have the actual revenue information, and what we do is we actually get monthly reports from Finance Canada. So every month we get sort of information based on what CRA is collected. And that allows us to track the revenues, but we know there's going to be a difference. So at the time of forecast update or public accounts, what we do is say, okay, well, we estimated this, but actually we've got some new information now. We've got to go back and re-estimate with the new tax information. Once we do that, there's going to be a difference. A little bit up, or a down, or sometimes a lot up, a lot down. And that difference between what we estimated at budget and then what we estimated with our new information throughout the year is what we call prior year adjustment. And that amount gets added to the revenues or subtracted from the revenues of that year. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that, in that when we get this new tax information, it not just means there's a difference between what's estimated and what we're getting, it also changes the estimate for the year and the next year and the next year because we have better information. So there's a couple of things always happening every time we do our revenue estimates. And the other thing I kind of wanted to share is just the level of detail that our Auditor General's office does in terms of revenue review. They actually have our models and they look through all of the models for the economics. They rerun our models with our inputs and they check our inputs. For our tax models, they actually look through our models and we write them down in equations. They review all of that. Then they look at our inputs. They look at the information that we get from Finance Canada to say, are you using the inputs that you've got? Have you using the right data? Then they actually sit with our staff, and staff show these are the inputs we've used. We run the model, and this is how it's and these are the outcomes. So there's a lot of verification. For our economics forecast, we also have something we do once a year, which is called our challenge session. We have sort of the leading economists from all of the major banks, the chief economists, Bank of Canada, from our universities. They're invited to a confidential session where we say here, and actually our Auditor General's office staff also attend. They are invited, and we ask them, these are our inputs, these are our draft estimates for budget. Do you think they're reasonable? Do you think they're prudent for as a basis for doing our revenue estimates? Sometimes they'll say, maybe this variable's a little bit too high, or maybe this input's a little bit too low, and we adjust based on some of that sort of professional judgment we get. So there's although it sounds like it's a big, sometimes my dad will say, that's kind of like a big fancy guess you're doing, but it's not. It is informed by some of the things that happened in the past, but we also have a very high level of scrutiny in terms of the reasonableness of our economic and revenue estimates for budget and
Order.
as well.
Thank you for that, and give our regards to your dad. Thank you. And so now we will move to the second round of questioning with 13 minutes each, and MLA Clark for the Liberal Caucus.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I was wondering if we look at additional appropriations, Deputy Dean, do we know or do we have a sense of how much of that is related to one-time capital versus operational? Do we have a breakdown of that level of detail for the spending?
Deputy Dean?
We don't have that with us, but yes, we could get that. We could tell you what is due to utilization, what might be capital. Yeah.
MLA Clark.
Thank you, and I would like to get that if we could to the committee. And I wonder, does the department have a view on that? I mean, is it my assumption, and maybe I'm wrong, but would it tend to be more on the capital project side, or do you tend not to do much on the operating side of things? Is that a bit more stable from year to year?
Deputy Dean.
So I will go out on a limb and I will say I don't think it would be more on the capital side. However, we have experienced increases in capital, but typically the capital plan comes in very close to what's been budgeted. It's likely more on operating, but again, we can get that for you.
MLA Clark.
Was there anything else there, or?
MLA Clark.
Yeah, I think Deputy Dean has an additional point on that, so she can go ahead.
Deputy Dean.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We would just appreciate just some clarification on what you mean by capital spending. Do you mean capital projects, like money gone to organizations for capital, or with respect to our capital plan?
MLA Clark.
The former, yeah. So projects going to, money going to recipients for capital projects that they would have, for example. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. And one of the, I was just going through the Auditor General's report from March there, and one of the things that struck me at the time and still does is that about 86% of the funding that the AG's office looked at, so 372 million roughly of the 430, at the time when the AG did this report was unspent at that point when the report was done. Is that, in your view, is that a problem, or is that more standard, or why? I guess my question is, why are we putting out, $370 million that is not being spent, within months, sometimes several months from when the project is approved? Is that normal, or is that not?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you. I believe there are times when government will provide money to a third party for a purpose that it's going to execute on behalf of government, so that it may be related to that. Geoff, would you like to make a further comment on that?
Associate Deputy Gatien.
Sure. Yeah, I think it all depends on the circumstance. But there are times where government makes a decision where a third party may be better suited to execute an initiative. And if it's something that will take an extended period of time, they may, if fiscal capacity materializes, provide sufficient funding so they have the certainty of money. So it can be something like that. We've seen efficiency one, I think, receive funds to that level. There are other examples where there may be other third parties that a recipient might be looking to have contribute as well. So there are times where government may provide funds early as a indication of support to sort of help catalyze other community interests. An example of that would be Ronald McDonald House. I believe the province was an early contributor there, hoping to encourage other provinces, other levels of government, some private sector fundraising to support that. It's real. It's going to happen. We believe in it. So those circumstances are examples where it would lead to, I think, a reasonable decision of government.
MLA Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yeah, one of the examples that I recall coming up at the time related to this, there were several around universities that stood out to me. So the $25 million to St. Mary's University for health programs, I remember at the time, SMU almost seemed surprised in some ways to receive the funds, and it wasn't obvious necessarily what it was going to be used for. So I take your point, ADM Gatien, where there's a Ronald McDonald House or something where there's a very clear project and it's got a timeline and it's pretty well set, and we know government wants to say, hey, we believe in this, that can leverage private sector fundraising, other levels. I get that, but it seems to me like there have been examples like this St. Mary's one where, could be a very good investment. There's obviously ideas behind it, but it seemed as though it wasn't fully baked when the money was distributed. So how does the department, I guess, balance that out to say, hey, we're going to give $25 million to St. Mary's here, but it doesn't seem like it's very concrete what the money's going for. How do you judge that, I guess, to make sure the money's being spent wisely?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you for that. And I'll preface it just by saying that I think the Department of Advanced Ed would have further details around that. But in general, the information that would be provided would be sufficient to conclude that the project's going to happen and that government has a desire to fund it.
MLA Clark.
Thank you. And if for whatever reason the project didn't go ahead or changed dramatically, is there any mechanism in place for the province to get the money back, for example, or how does that work in that scenario?
Deputy Dean.
really good question, and I think that depends on the agreement that's struck between government and the organization receiving the funding. I think that would be a question for advanced education on that specific project, but in general, we would definitely try to ensure that any agreements that are made with organizations receiving government funding, that would be clear.
MLA Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And is it 5 minutes roughly that I have left? Okay. And another thing that, I'm not an accountant, and this is why I don't think in these terms, but another thing that the AG's office mentioned that I thought was interesting was the issue around, interest, for example, which, again, doesn't cross my mind. I'm not the numbers accounting guru, but it was an interesting point where if you're out tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars that the province could have earning interest, and instead it's earning interest for some other third party, that seems like an issue. So I'm just wondering what's the department's response to that, and how do you, I guess, avoid or minimize that as much as possible so that third parties are not, benefiting unduly from funds that are public funds at the end of the day.
Deputy Dean.
Yeah, we appreciate the Auditor General's comments around this issue. What we would say is, when agreements are made with organizations and we provide money, if they generate interest on that money, that interest generally would go towards the purpose that the organization is executing on government's behalf or for the good of the community. So for the good of that organization's purpose. Having said that, we do think there's an opportunity to review our approach and make sure that that is clear. Sometimes those amounts wouldn't be very large, but for some of these organizations, they could just divert that into their service offerings. So that would be of benefit to them, for their agreed upon purpose. And we can make that clearer in some cases. So we agree that that is an opportunity. I think the other piece in this is we're not really foregoing a lot of interest revenue because the province borrows money not on a specific initiative, but we have a borrowing program. And then we look at it in a larger perspective, I would say. But again, we do think that there's an opportunity to maybe improve language around that particular issue. Yes.
Associate Deputy Gatien.
And all I wanted to add was that was an area where we've certainly accepted the spirit of the recommendation from the Auditor General in our grants management policy. We have gone back and we've revised the policy to be more clear, provide a little bit more guidance about interest when you might advance money out. Any residual funds where they return to the province. So we have worked to improve our policy on that. We've spent a lot of time, Justin Melnick and Rob Bourgeois, working with broadly through government policy and our financial staff about this and how we should look to have these issues considered on a submission by submission or initiative by initiative basis.
MLA Clark with 2 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess one other question I was wondering about these projects that, as I said, might not be, ready to go day one when the money's distributed. Does the department have a standard or a timeline at which you will choose to give or not give money? Like, let's say there's a proposal and they say, hey, we're planning to break ground in 3 years or 5 years. Is there a point at which it's too far in the future that government won't give out money during any given fiscal year?
Deputy Dean.
I think we would look at that on a case-by-case basis. I think it would depend on the project. It would depend on the magnitude of the project. It would depend on whether there are other funders potentially that would be coming to the table to execute a project. So I think it really has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis within reasonable limits. And again, we'd be guided by government decision-making around that.
MLA Clark with 1 minute and 20 seconds.
1 minute, 20 seconds. Okay, great. Well, I don't really want to put anybody on the spot for a quick question because I don't have any of that quick. But I just want to thank the witnesses. As I said earlier, I do think there's issues of accountability here. I take the deputy and everybody's points, and I know that the department does a really good job of managing the finances of the province. I have no question about that. I just think there's mechanisms in place that, from a democratic perspective, which is not your purview, I know, would be better served for opposition members, government members. Again, it's a merry-go-round, and you're not always in power, and so I think that's an important issue. But I appreciate everybody's time in answering all of our questions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll now move on to the NDP with MLA Lachance.
Thank you. So I think picking up on this discussion, I think there are, a myriad of concerns about the growing use of additional appropriations. So one is the sheer size. So, approximately 10% of the budget, and no sense of whether there's any kind of, there isn't a legislated upper limit, so this could continue on and on. And I think it's out of step with the rest of the country. I think that these allocations could actually still be made if they were in the public interest, and we could still have better accountability. And then I think, the review done by the Auditor General really called into question the value for money. So, of the random selection of projects that were reviewed, my colleague talked about the ones in post-secondary education. The allocation for the health stats program to St. Mary's, for instance, really made no sense at all. So there was no academic program that was going to start in September of that year. That was not an emergency allocation. The issues around the inability to audit, you've walked through that, in general, the assignment of interest would be to the recipient of the funding for their general purposes, which is, great if the money is actually needed. Again, I would argue that like St. Mary's and some of the other post-secondary allocations weren't actually urgent allocations. But the problem was that a lot of agreement, the problem was that some allocations were made as additional appropriations without any sort of contract, or the contract was silent, right? The contract was silent on interest issues. The contract was silent on the return of unused funds. The contracts were silent on administration costs. So, so I guess the question is around value for money. So have changes been made to address not only the interest earned, but also the return of unused funds? You talked about updating the grant management policy. Who's doing that, and what's the timeline on that?
Deputy Dean.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate the question. I do want to just clarify, though, that all additional appropriations are not related to emergencies. I think there's various reasons and a rationale for the additional appropriations, but certainly emergency situations are one use for them. With respect to the grants management policy, we do agree that there's an opportunity for clarification and some tightening, and so we've worked actually over the past several months to design a new grants management policy, to roll it out to departments, to ensure that they have an understanding about how that would apply in their context. And one of the authors of that is here with us. That's Rob Bourgeois. So I'm going to ask Rob to perhaps elaborate on what we've done.
Executive Director Bourgeois and the author.
Sure. So our grants management policy was effective March of 2023. So it was in place, but as the OEG mentioned in their report, it was not part of the scope of their report, so they didn't look into the grants management policy. But we certainly take and we accept their last recommendation on those areas of the grant and subsidy payments that we make, making sure that we are ensuring in contracts that there are measurable performance targets, that there's conflict of interest, there's right to audit, there's assignment of interest earned on funds, the return of unused funds to the province, and even limits on administration costs, because that can, be an area of focus on funds going out the door if third parties are providing a service on our behalf from a grants management perspective. So those are all in our policy, and certainly we'll take another look at it to make sure that they're all covered going forward.
MLA Lachance.
And how are you monitoring compliance? Because, you know, we were certainly presented with a range of examples where there wasn't compliance with the grant management policy.
Right. So I think what we learned...
Executive Director Bourgeois.
Sorry. I think what we learned from the report was that we probably didn't do a great job at program evaluation and follow-up. So that's an area that is a focus in the grants management policy. It's been rolled out through a number of training sessions last fall, this past spring, across departments. And the expectation is that departments get on board and comply with the policy, add those criteria to their agreements, but certainly go that extra step and do a better job of following up and ensuring that the performance targets are met or not, and decisions from there.
MLA Lachance.
I just have, I guess, one quick question before I hand it over to my colleague, MLA LeBlanc. But so we've talked about the fluctuations in revenue and sort of the unexpected revenue which flowed into the province over the last number of years. And so on one hand, you know, when I see things going out the door that I don't perceive as not foreseeable during a normal budgeting process. So I guess, you know, I take your point that it's not all emergencies, but I would also like just wonder why that allocation, you know, certain allocations have to be made in year. You know, I would say even like Ronald McDonald House is a great example. I mean, that plan to rebuild Ronald McDonald House has been underway for a long time. That could have, and I would argue should have been an anticipated, budgeted expense for government. There's no reason why that would be unanticipated, in my humble opinion. But if you have increased revenue and it isn't allocated, what happens to it? So if you end the year with, what happens to the surplus at the end of any given year?
Deputy Dean.
I'll defer to the accountant on this one.
Associate Deputy Gatien.
So if government made decisions not to advance certain priorities, then a deficit would be smaller, a surplus would be greater, and then it goes over to accumulated deficit and would reduce accumulated deficit, reduce net debt.
MLA Lachance.
And, you know, I guess, you know, what I wonder is, and I actually can't remember, I'm not like sort of like I wonder and I remember, but I really don't remember. When the Finance Act of 2010 was developed, I mean, we were in an incredible amount of debt crisis that was really limiting what government could do on a number of occasions. So I'm just wondering if this function of the Finance Act was actually anticipated when government would be in times when there'd be unexpected revenue flows. Because here's my concern, is that I would argue that we had a few examples, and maybe there are more, of where additional appropriations were not warranted, where we're not getting value for money for Nova Scotians, or like we have no idea if we are because there's not a contract in place or the contracts don't have the proper elements. So we have no idea if we're getting value for money. And at the same time, our debt is increasing. Our net debt to GDP ratio is increasing. And when that happens, and when it comes to a point where that debt is so great, or that debt to GDP ratio is so great, that actually government enters a period where you have to start pulling back on expenditures. And on additional, just one more thing, just before I turn it over, my concern about that in this current scenario is that we have a healthcare crisis that shows no signs of abating. We have a housing crisis. We have all these huge pressures on government, and we're not seeing those priorities being addressed. So what happens when we end up in a period of austerity where we haven't addressed the crises, where we don't have the revenues, and we have to start contracting or constricting government expenditures?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you. I'll try to address your question in a couple of points. I'm just going to start with when fiscal capacity materializes and then what happens. So, when we find that there's an ability to make decisions because there's additional fiscal capacity, that allows government to look at priorities that perhaps it wasn't able to fund through the budget process, but sees that there are resources that can be directed towards those priorities. So government will decide what those priorities are. And, as we have seen, it's about health. It's about homelessness. It's about affordability. It's about, things that are required to address the pressures of a growing population. So government has been directing resources in those areas, as well as other areas that are deemed to be priorities. When you talk about I think what you're asking about is our debt level sustainable over the long term, and will these decisions be creating pressure in out years on our fiscal plan that we can't handle? And I think the answer to that is really found in what the bond rating agencies say about the province's fiscal position and how they rate us. And all three rating agencies confirm that the province's credit rating is stable. They've given us a stable outlook. And even in their latest opinion, they're saying that our fiscal position is expected to remain stable and predictable. So, within that framework, government makes the decisions about how to move forward and how to balance those priorities and how to invest in those priorities.
So I'm going to pass it to my colleague.
MLA LeBlanc.
How much time?
2 minutes.
Great. Wrap it up here. This has been a really interesting discussion, and in fact, every time I had a question, someone else would sort of address it, and so most of my questions have been taken. But I do want to say, for a good part of the meeting, the explanation of the additional appropriations and the increase was because of things coming up. So the increase in homelessness, and we need to buy pallet shelters, or this really great health technology has come forward, and so we need to get it as soon as possible and not wait for a budget process. And but that being said, and I kind of buy that, but I also have lots of questions about lots of the appropriations, which do seem like it's weird that they weren't budgeted. For instance, just number one, the Acadia University Nursing Program. In no way do I want to debate the value of that. I think that's amazing that we're going to have a nursing program at Acadia. But how is it possible that before the budget was written that wasn't thought of or in any way discussed? It just seems shocking to me that we would be planning with such short timelines. Anyway, I guess because I only have a couple of minutes, my question is, or my comment is, even if all of the things are accepted that have been brought here today, it doesn't explain or get at the number one question, which is why these things can't come before the legislature. So, all of this stuff in the way that other provinces do it can be nimble enough that these additional appropriations can come before the legislature before or after they're allocated or spent. So the question is, with this government who is having a hard time with transparency in general, and I say that in a very kind and soft way, why is it that we can't bring this forward?
And order, your time is up.
Thank you.
We will now move to the PC caucus with MLA McLeod.
Thank you very much. Good morning. The witnesses have described a bit of the process overall, but could you clearly explain what checks and balances are in place for the additional appropriations process?
Deputy Dean.
I'm going to ask ADM Gatien to answer that.
Associate Deputy Gatien.
Thank you. So I believe it starts within the departments that would be seeking the additional appropriations. So there's a ministry responsible for the activities of that year and the execution. So between our finance team that would support the departments and then the departmental staff, they'd be working through the year about where are we spending against what our year is. Are things trending towards a pressure? Are some things being mitigated? So those conversations would be regular within the department. When they see that the pressures look to be greater than what the appropriation is, then discussions would start with central agencies like Treasury Board office within Finance and Treasury Board, an Executive Council office with some policy folks to start talking about what the pressures are. When we get close to a public forecast update, departments forecast in regularly to Treasury Board office, not every month, but they'll not a detailed forecast every month. Some are kind of an off cycle by exception. But as those are coming in, those are getting evaluated, and we're keeping track of how things look. So when we start to see pressures materialize, additional appropriations likely, you start having the discussions at those levels about what are the assumptions behind this? Are you sure? Do you really think that this is going to materialize? Because sometimes an early trend doesn't actually perpetuate for the year. But as we get to our public forecast updates, we are responsible to work with management's best estimate of what it looks like from what we've incurred to date and what we expect from that date to the end of the year. So there's a lot of discussion between there. And when we conclude that the forecast would be appropriate to show over the appropriation, that's when we start getting the ministries to repair their reports of their ministers to the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board. And then that really kicks off like a final review and meeting of the minds as to what appears to be the most likely circumstance and whether an additional appropriation is necessary. Then it gets into a submission, a report and recommendation to Executive Council for their consideration and approval if they deem it appropriate.
MLA McLeod.
Thank you. We've spoken about emergencies. Now, do emergencies in different key areas impact the way that these additional appropriations are distributed?
Deputy Dean.
Thank you. I think you know, how I would answer that is like depending on what is required in a particular circumstance, government will respond and invest as it needs to invest. And to, you know, if an additional appropriation is made for a specific purpose and it's required in different parts of the province, that's how it would be distributed, or it's how government would distribute it.
MLA McLeod.
How do these additional appropriations align with the province's financial goals?
Deputy Dean.
I would say that the additional appropriations, again, as we've talked about, are a truing up of the department's spending authority, in essence. And so government decisions are made based on their priorities. And so if a department is requiring more money to execute a program, then that is going to be aligned with government and where government wants to go. So the additional appropriation is just the way to enhance that department's ability to execute that program and have the funds required to do so if it goes beyond what was in the department's existing budget.
MLA McLeod.
Thank you. We'll pass it on to one of my colleagues.
MLA McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe I've got 7 minutes. Am I correct?
You are correct.
Thank you. So just to get back to, let's see how I do with this, ADM, Kumaranayake, how bad did I do that? It's probably the first time I actually took a stab at it. You were talking, and I remember the meeting we had before, it was probably 2 years ago, where we were talking about how come we're not, and I'm a numbers person, how come we're actually missing it and we're not getting the details? And you were explaining that previously, and I'm giving this for the benefit of the members that are new, 5 years ago, it was really close. But what happened is everybody realized Nova Scotia is the best place to live, just so all the millions know. And so because we had people moving here, we recovered a lot quicker, like Nova Scotians did. That's how all of this happened. I wasn't aware of the 18 months. But so, and I know you didn't get to finish your conversation on that portion, so I want to give you some time to actually explain like how, you know, the prior year adjustments, how those work, and how come it's just something that we're not going to be able to nail down, but you were comfortable, and I'm putting you on the record this one, that we are getting better because we're now modifying the models to take into account stuff that we just didn't expect. I mean, Nova Scotians pulled, I mean, just ahead of the whole country. Like, we recovered a lot quicker than anybody expected, and I'm one that did not expect us to recover this quick. So I'd like your comment on that.
Deputy Dean or?
No, ADM Kumaranayake. Oh no, I want to do her last name and get it right.
Kumaranayake, you were close there.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
I'll try better.
Yeah. So, and I will say, so pre-pandemic, and one of the things my staff have been spending some time on over the summer is really assessing our models and whether they need to change. Like, have there been structural changes in the economy that our models aren't picking up, and that will impact our revenue estimates? Because pre-pandemic, our models were functioning very well. You know, we'd have some years we'd have something, a larger prior year adjustment. In those days, that was probably 400, 500 million. And that often was associated with offshore revenues, right? And so there was always either accounting adjustments or something that came up. Then we had our pandemic period where things, because of, we knew things were not going to normal, but we didn't have the data to tell us exactly what the difference was. So that was where that period where our models really, I would say, underperformed a little bit, and where we saw that the revenue swings in our budgets, and then the actuals in public accounts. What we're now starting to see in our in terms of our economy and our economic growth is we're returning to our pre-pandemic trends. So we're starting to stabilize, but we're at a different point. For years, we had no population growth. Then we had quite a high population growth, about 3.5%. Now it's down to about 2.6%, so pretty steady. And that has an impact in terms of the economy. From a tax revenue perspective, we've had an increase in our number of tax filers and the actual tax that they're paying. But again, it took us about 18 months to get the actual data, right? So what we're seeing now, as we've had a little bit more time from that pandemic window, is a little bit more of a normalization, but also our economy is more robust, right? We have had good growth. We are seeing different sectors have stabilized and are flourishing. So that is reflected in our tax numbers. It's also been, though, a little bit harder over the last several months as in terms of the interest rate and inflation environment. So we're starting to see that as well. We're starting to see folks can't spend as much, right? And so we anticipate that'll be some of the things that we'll be starting to monitor, we'll continue to monitor, but may show up because there has, and that was an obvious and deliberate policy attempt from the Bank of Canada to slow down the economy a little bit so that interest rates could come down. So there are a lot of things that Nova Scotia can't control, but do impact us. And so we kind of try and monitor them and take that into as much into account as possible when we're doing these numbers and our estimates. But and then we keep saying revenue estimates because we know the next time around the numbers will change and they'll be a little bit different. Yeah.
MLA McDonald.
So I'm not sure who's going to. So when technically does budget start for the next year? Because I think that's one thing that's missing. From a municipal standpoint, it started about November, December for March. So I think we should look at that because that could be why something's not in the budget and had to go on an expert appropriation.
Deputy Dean.
Thank you for that. Budget starts now. Budget is underway, well underway. And really, departments, there is the official budget process, but we're always budgeting throughout the year. Having said that, as we enter the budget process, we're absolutely thinking about the things that we need to do, that have impacts on out years. There are considerations that right now are underway with respect to existing programs and the pressures associated with them, and are they growing, and what will be required to continue to offer these, and at what level. So those types of decisions that type of analysis is going on right now as we work through that business planning and budget process, which again would be March whenever we do the budget. So I would say that it's not necessarily always about unexpected things. It is pressures in programs that we know about that grow, that need to be addressed.
MLA McDonald, with just about a minute.
Okay, I'll get a question then. So to that point, if we started the budget process and a department thought, I'm not going to submit this because you know what, that's 2 years out. That's 3 years out before we started. But halfway through that tax year, they're going like, oh my God, like we actually can get this started. That would be a reason for an additional appropriation. For example, the example that my colleague mentioned across about the additional nursing at Acadia. So would that not also fall into a wide appropriation because they thought it was 3 years out and it's in the plan, but we don't budget for 4 years out. We budget what's going to happen next year. Unless it's capital, then it's always there.
Deputy Dean.
Fair comment. There could be examples where something that a department wanted to do could be brought forward because there's fiscal capacity to do so. So there are examples where that could be the case.
And that gives us just 2 minutes, so we'll say that the time for questioning is closed. And I want to thank each of our witnesses for being here today, and I'll offer up an opportunity for Deputy Dean to give some closing remarks.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to meet with you today. I would just like to say that I have complete confidence in the professionalism of our staff with respect to how we conduct ourselves, how we perform our duties in the department, and I really appreciate the opportunity that you've given us to clarify the additional appropriation process. So thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. So that will close this part of our meeting. Does the committee wish to have a recess? Seeing no need for a recess, we will just wait for our members to leave. Thank you. So as we know, as they clear out, we will go to the item on the agenda with regards to the agenda and procedures record of decision. The subcommittee met September 11th to review suggested topics and witnesses in relation to the 2024 follow-up report from May from the Auditor General. And I think you have the information before you. I'll open up the floor for discussion. And perhaps someone could put a motion forward. We will need one. MLA LeBlanc.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I will move that we plan 2 meetings as part of the follow-up of Auditor General's reports. The first meeting would be the topic of 2019 selection and quality management of bridge projects, 2019 QE2 New Generation Project Phase 1, 2020 QE2 New Generation Project Phase 2, 2021 contaminated sites, and 2021 Internet for Nova Scotia. And so the witnesses would be the Deputy Minister of the Department of Public Works, the President and CEO of Build Nova Scotia, and the Interim President and CEO of Nova Scotia Health. So that would be the first. That would be the first meeting.
Anyone further? Everyone in agreement with that? All in favor? Contrary-minded? Motion's passed. MLA Taggart.
Briefing on that first?
It is my understanding that we will be going back to having briefings. I'll go to the clerk to clarify.
So with regard to the follow-up meetings on the follow-up reports, we haven't had briefings on those because the Auditor General has already presented the follow-up report and noted that these are the departments that maybe could have improvement. But obviously, if the committee wants to have a briefing, we can arrange that, I'm assuming.
Any MLA LeBlanc?
Yeah, I don't feel the need for a briefing, but I will make a second motion, which is the second meeting. We did, didn't we? Shall I make a second motion? So the second meeting would be the topics would be the 2020 Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation Phase 1, 2021 Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation Phase 2, 2021 Planning and Implementation of the Pre-Primary Program, and 2021 Value for Money of Early COVID-19 Relief Programs. And the departments would be the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation, President and CEO, the Deputy Minister of the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development, and maybe the Deputy Minister of Health, which is not on this list, but I think maybe we forgot that given that we would be discussing COVID relief.
Motion's on the floor. All in favor?
Hold on. Just a minute.
MLA McDonald.
So we dealt with this as subcommittee, and I'm just questioning, because it was maybe whatever, I'm just trying to figure out, was your motion to add them or not? Because it wasn't clear to me onto it, so I don't want to vote on something unless I know, was your motion to add the Deputy Minister of it or not? So just, I need to know what I'm voting on.
MLA LeBlanc.
Yes, I was making that motion on the fly, but if we need a separate motion to add and then adopt this, then I can also do that. So to be clear, I think we should invite the Deputy Minister of Health and Wellness to that meeting.
MLA McDonald.
So if that's your motion, I just need to know that's what the motion was, so.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to remember who was responsible for that, so just give me a second.
MLA Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The witnesses, that would have been recommended to us from the Auditor General, I think we'll stick with the recommended witnesses for that.
So we'll have to amend it.
So the motion on the floor is to include MLA LeBlanc.
Madam Chair, can we ask the Auditor General if she recommended the Department of Health and Wellness?
You always have the option to ask the Auditor General. Any mic will do.
So good morning.
AG, Ms. Adair.
I think we were just sort of pulling the report that's referred to on the early COVID relief, and I think we didn't recommend the Deputy Minister of Health because the programs were not specific to the Department of Health. And I can't recall right now what the reports were or the programs were on. There were some being delivered by Dalhousie University. But I would have to look at the report to... But we would have recommended the Deputy Minister of Health if we thought it was appropriate.
Okay. MLA LeBlanc, do you wish to amend your motion? MLA LeBlanc.
Controversial. I would say, why don't we just remove that and maybe come back to it later, the whole COVID-19 thing? Because it seems weird if we have COVID-19 on the agenda, but we have the Liquor Corporation and Education as the only witnesses. It doesn't, like, we would have no one to ask questions to unless it's completely connected to the Department of Education. So what are people's thoughts about that?
Does the AG wish to provide clarification with regards to what we were trying to accomplish with this item?
I need to review the report. I mean, this was 2021.
Okay, MLA LaChance.
So I think it sounds like it would be good to have a review and maybe reconsider these witnesses. For instance, I do know, so Dalhousie University was contracted to provide support to small businesses. And so there was like funding for going online and other types of sort of short-term funding provided. So I know, so I don't know though, whether that means we should have someone from advanced education or economic development. So I think some review would be warranted.
MLA Young, did you have a question?
I was just going to amend the motion to have the witnesses as presented, as recommended by the Auditor General. So just removing the additional witnesses and just have the ones that were recommended by the AG.
And did the AG wish to add something? Ms. Adair?
That audit was Finance and Treasury Board and the Department of Education. Finance and Treasury Board had implemented the recommendations, but there was a question about the early childhood education programs. I think it was support to the daycares. That was the program, if I recall, off the top of my head. And it was those recommendations that were not implemented at the time we released this follow-up report, which is why we suggested the committee call them.
MLA LeBlanc, as you know, MLA Young just put an amendment to your motion
So
on the
I
floor.
would support that amendment.
Okay. So the amendment is on the floor. All in favor?
Aye.
Contrary-minded? The amendment is passed. And now on the amended motion, all in favor? Contrary-minded? The motion amended is passed.
We should also talk about, they also recommended about writing letters right down here. So do
Okay.
you want to address that as well?
So as you see on your sheets with Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedures, at the bottom of the sheet are other items. Is there any motions to write letters on the following items that are there? Department of Cybersecurity, Department of Agriculture, and Department of Justice. MLA LeBlanc.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I will make a motion that, as per the recommendation of the Auditor General, that the committee writes letters to the following departments requesting updates on the implementation of recommendations: the Department of Cybersecurity and Digital Solutions around the Information Access and Privacy Information Technology projects, the Department of Agriculture, the Diversity and Inclusion in the Public Service, and the Department of Justice, Diversity and Inclusion in the Public Service.
The motion is on the floor. MLA McDonald.
Just a question. Your motion was the committee. I believe the Auditor General normally writes those letters, not us. So I'm just making sure. It is the committee? Look at that. Okay. All right. I'm good. Thanks.
Commented and clarified all in once. Thank you. And so the motion is on the floor to send these letters. All in favor?
Aye.
Contrary-minded? The motion is passed. MLA Young?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know you and I discussed this in the past couple of days and stuff, but just to get on the record, we do have pre-hearing briefings and stuff, and I think we've combined them, went from one, we put two in there. So I'd expect that the normal process after next meeting would be going back to the pre-hearing briefings. Yeah.
That is my understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm not seeing, MLA Taggart?
So on that subject, so have we because I know my memory's not that bad, but I'm sure I haven't been briefed on all of these here particular topics that we're going to talk about at our next meeting. Well, we're talking about 2019 selection of quality management, QE2 generational project, 2020 QE2 general phase 2. Like, I don't want to go into this blind. So it's this question of briefings. When?
I will, just for clarification and to give the history, I will go to Ms. Langell to give you that clarity.
We can maybe ask the Auditor General as well, but as I mentioned earlier, what happens with the follow-up report is that she delivers the follow-up report, and we'll talk about all these various departments that perhaps haven't done as well as they might have, and some that have. And then as a result of that is the briefing, because she's presented the report, and then from that, the subcommittee meets, looks at what's been suggested, and then meetings are determined from there. That's not to say that if the committee wants to have a pre-hearing briefing, subject to what the Auditor General can or can't do, I guess that could be decided.
And we have 1 minute. MLA LeBlanc.
I say we go back to our research departments and our individual caucuses and see if we can't get the research that we need from them. And then if that proves to be impossible, then we can have the discussion at the next meeting.
That's all food for thought. We'll take that into consideration. So with the time limited, next meeting's October 2nd, right here, and the meeting is now adjourned.